that the effectiveness of e-learning is something that we all, to some extent, focus on. Because we can see within research that within the last decade, the papers being published on the topic has increased with 70%. That's a lot. And we also know as learning and development professionals that there's a demand on us to prove that we are worth our money, that we are actually making effective learning solutions. And in these times with the economic crisis and so on, we also know that the supporting functions out there in the businesses, that is HR and learning, is being cut down if we cannot show that we're delivering something that isn't effective. So there's really a strong focus on this, and there has been for several years, but it seems like we continue to focus on how can we ensure effectiveness and how can we measure it, very much how can we measure it. But I'll get back to that. Yeah. Okay, so the literature study, what we did was that we looked at, or we made a structured search in 30 academic databases, and we found 761 articles on the topic of effectiveness of e-learning. And we had the criteria that these studies, they had to be within adult learning context. So what do I mean by that? It has to be within higher education, professional education, or work-related learning. And we also wanted these studies to be empirical studies. So that was our criteria, so a very, very broad search. And it says 761 plus because there's more publications coming in all the time. What we've done so far is that we've carefully read the abstract of 224 abstracts, and then we found 111 that met the criteria. So everything I'm telling you now is based on these 111 abstracts. What we then did was that we have done a detailed coding of these 111 abstracts. And what does that mean? Well, we have a pretty extensive coding tree, and for every abstract we go in and we find, for instance, which theories do they use? What is the research design? How do they define effectiveness? Who are their target audience? And so on and so forth. So a lot of different elements that we are coding to get this meta view on all the abstracts, so we can say something more generally about the field. Make sense? And yeah, there are more details, much more details in the article. So I'll go a bit further into the results that we have found. You're not going to see much text on my slides, so you have to listen to what I'm saying. Or you can find it in the article. The results are structured around 3 questions. This is the first one. So how is the effectiveness of e-learning defined? The second question that I'm going to go into in a minute is how is the effectiveness of e-learning measured? And thirdly, we're going to look at what makes e-learning effective. I can't tell you all about that, but I'll give you a few. So what we're dealing with here is that we looked at our codings for these papers and found out that there were no less than 19 different definitions of the effectiveness of e-learning. So that could, for instance, be that you define it as learning outcome. What has the students learned based on the e-learning? It could be that you focus on organizational results. It could be that you focus on satisfaction, self-efficacy, and so on and so forth. And of course, a lot of studies use different, more elements. So many of you may know Kirkpatrick, 4-level evaluation, and they would focus on both satisfaction, learning outcome, behavior change, and organizational results. So, of course, they use several of these, but there's 19 different ones, so not just the 4. And learning outcome is by far the most used. It makes sense when we talk about higher education, of course, we're interested in what do they learn. But when it comes to work-related learning, the focus is much more on transfer, so the application to practice. How do we apply the knowledge in practice? Which again makes sense, right? Because in in work-related learning, well, it's nice that you learn a lot, but really you have to perform. You have to use it in your job. And, well, why is this important? I put these two here. And we think it's important because we also see that in 13% of the abstract, the effectiveness of e-learning is left completely undefined. And even in the paper sometimes, the researchers do not define the effectiveness. Yet we see that there's so many different ways to define it. And if you're learning and development professional and you sit there with your key stakeholder and you think about completion, we want as many as possible to go through this, and that's effective. But your stakeholders thinking about transfer, we need them to perform, right? If you don't talk about what are the goals to our learning solution and what makes it effective, you can easily end up with some misunderstanding. But on the other hand, it's the upside that you have this kind of flexibility to look at your solution and figure out what does effectiveness mean for us. So it's both ways. Make sense? Okay. Good. So that was the first question. And the second one we looked at is how is the effectiveness of e-learning measured? And we see that 73% of the researchers measure the effectiveness of e-learning through quantitative methods. That is solely quantitative methods. If we add to that the papers where mixed methods are used, it's actually 90% that use quantitative methods, only leaving 10% to solely qualitative studies. And it might not be a surprise because we also know that when you want your papers to be published, it's often those that can show that they're effective, of course, and then they're statistically significant, right? And if it's numbers just tend to be more credible for us. We tend to believe that it's unbiased, even though, of course, they're not. In the paper, what we do is that we talk about this, and of course, it's not an issue to use quantitative methods. We do that all the time. But really, we can make our evaluation methods so much more valid and powerful if we add a qualitative method. So there's some of that in the paper. And then, of course, there's a lot of comparative studies. So half of all the studies that we've looked at are comparative studies, comparing e-learning, online learning, to face-to-face learning, or blended learning, of course. And just, well, that's half of the study, and I think it's because we still have this tendency to think about online learning as taking the classroom online. So we try to do what we've traditionally done, but we just want to do it online. And then it becomes really interesting to see, can we do that as good as we do it face-to-face? But we also transfer the flaws of the classroom into the online world. And I couldn't help noticing that Didi this morning said that, because Didi said that it's like filming a play, I believe he said, right? The MOOCs. And I think that is an issue, because that comparison sometimes becomes comparing bananas with apples. Anyway, half of them do that. And let me just... Sorry, baby brain kicking in here. Yes. Okay, third question is the next. The third question is, what makes e-learning solutions effective? Actually, this is a different question, because what we wanted to do was that I would really like to answer this question about which e-learning solutions are effective, right? It would be nice to say, okay, always use simulations. You know, we can't quite do that, but we did actually have codings that we could look at to get answers to that question. But what we saw is that, well, we went in and we coded all the abstract on, did the researchers deem the study as effective, non-effective, or partly effective. And when we looked at that, we saw that 67% of the studies were deemed effective. And then it must be 23% partly effective, and only 10% not effective. And once again, it's like, does it then make sense to try to answer that question? Because there's something going on here, right? And yet again, it's not really a surprise that it's easy to get a paper published where you say that our solution is effective, right? We get these results. That's what we want to read about. And we also had this discussion about that there might be some bias in it, because a lot of the researchers are actually also the developers, so they have a stake in claiming that it's effective. That doesn't have to be a problem if you have the transparency needed, but in what we wanted to do, it was kind of a problem. So we said then instead, let's try to answer the question, what makes e-learning solutions effective? So instead of doing all the quantitative stuff solely, we also wanted to look at it more qualitatively. And we had coded what the researchers said was important for e-learning effectiveness. So let's look at that. Okay. These are all the factors that the researchers mentioned. We have, well, at least partly grounded approach. So this is their words, what they are actually saying. And we have then decided to put it into these categories. This has to do with the e-learning solution. Second one, the individual. And the third one, the contextual factors. And to me, at least, it's really interesting to see how there's so much focus on what we need to do with the e-learning for it to be effective. There's also some focus on the individual, so the learner. How does the learner affect whether it's effective or not? And very little on the context, even though, at least for workplace learning, it's absolutely critical that we have the time and resources to actually make knowledge into forms. I don't expect you to be able to read all this. It's in the paper, and what we did was to turn it into a model instead. This one is not in the paper. So once again, we've taken this list and then said, this is some categories within this. Right? So when we look at the individual, that's, I think, the green arrows up here. The two things that seem to be important. Experience, so previous experience, and that's both online experience, so experience using computers. That has an effect on whether it's effective or not. Makes sense? But also any relevant work experience within the field will also affect if it's effective. What I find interesting about that is that here it actually becomes really important how you define effectiveness. Because the experience can increase effectiveness, but it can also decrease it. Right? So if you look at previous work experience, and you have a person who's very experienced within the field, going through an online learning, if you define effectiveness as satisfaction, that person might have a very low score because it wasn't challenging. I didn't find it good. But when it comes to how that person is performing on a test or performing at work, it could be a very high score. So if that's how you define effectiveness, it can be very high. So once again, how you define it, and these factors actually come into play here. Expectations is more about, as we know, motivation, perception of learning, and so on. Looking at the contextual factors, it's resources and support. Resources, that's of course technical resources, but it's also something like time. And I cannot underline that enough, because having the time to actually be able to turn knowledge into performance for workplace learning is absolutely critical. We continue to have this belief that if we go to a course and we learn something and we do well in a test, we go out and we change our behaviors. We don't do that, or very rarely. And to have the time to actually come back to work and also take the time to be incompetent for a while we change your behaviors. Birgitte talked about unlearning, and that comes into play here too. So you need the time and support from managers and co-workers to try it out. and to be comfortable again, so you can be a better performer. The blue arrows here is then all about the e-learning, and the factors that you've seen here, they're all about interaction and practice. And you hear once again, you need to have clear feedback, you need to have personalized interaction, practice, you need to practice everything you have to do, you've seen the simulations and so on and so forth. So that's the key part here. And what I find interesting about the e-learning is that once again you can see that there's something going on with this comparison with face-to-face and online learning, because interaction and practice is what you can more easily do in face-to-face situations. And it's harder to do e-learning, but we're trying to make online or e-learning as good alternative to face-to-face. So of course we focus on this because we need this in order for it to be as effective as face-to-face. And once again, I'm thinking about whether that is how we want to look at it, if we want to start comparing apples to apples instead of this face-to-face and online learning, and respect that there are different modalities, and maybe the different modalities need different definitions of effectiveness. I'll leave you with that question and then just bring your attention to that inner paper. There's a few other things that we go into just briefly. We talk about the increase of research. There's also a list of all the definitions that I didn't put up here. We talk a little bit about self-assessment, the say-do conflict. Survey validity, that's about the qualitative elements that can really make our assessments more valid. And also use a saying valid when we talk about qualitative research. Anyway, there's also something about unintended transfer, that there's a lot of things going on that we cannot get in a rating scale. And then also some learning strategies to avoid transfer. We mentioned an empirical study where we have very thoroughly studied 7 teachers and how they interact with an e-learning solution. And there we see some strategies to avoid transfer that we found interesting. We had to put them in there.